As you know, on Sunday night or Monday morning of every week, we post a new expository semiotics explaining why we would choose which lectionary readings. But in these readings, our dream is, and our desire is, to help you read the signs and fondle the details and spot the seminal metaphors, the condensed signs and the stories that are key for preaching to a digital culture. So strap on your seatbelt and join us as we prospect our passages for today. Vlog number 21. We got a great text today. It follows immediately after last week's Jesus feeding of the 15,000, 20,000, whatever the number is. But I want to do it a little differently today. We're going to be looking at this very famous passage of, quote, Jesus walking on the water. The feeding the 5,000 occurs in all four Gospels. This story occurs in 3 of the 4, which is also unusual. And I want to read all 3 of them because what you know this story for may not be what we should know this story for, or should be the most obvious thing or most familiar thing that we know this story for. And when you immediately think of Jesus walking on the water, you immediately think of a title that has been very familiar and famous and has sold millions of copies of books. If you want to walk on the water, you what? You got to get out of the boat. And you've heard sermons on this. You got to take that leap of faith. You got to step out into the water. If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. So it's a story. These stories are supposed to encourage us to take the risk, the leap of faith, to get out of the boat and to come where Jesus is calling us, into the unknown, into the uncertain. And it's a great concept. It's a great story, except it's not this story. And that's the problem. And that's my challenge for you today, is maybe the story, if you read it as a story and not to extract some nice little homiletic principles out of it, maybe it's a story about something very, very different. So our gospel reading is from Matthew, and Matthew, the 14th chapter, verses 20 to the end of the story. But I want to read the story as it's found in the other 2 accounts, the other 2 Gospels, Mark and John. And this is the story in Matthew's Gospel here that we're going to spend most of our time with, but I still want to set the backdrop of the other 2 stories. So listen carefully as I read to you first the Mark version and then the John version. So here's Mark 6, verses 45 to 56. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida. Now notice it says immediately Jesus did what? Made his disciples. In other words, they didn't want to do this. They didn't want to do this without him. So let's set the stage. He's done feeding the 15,000, 20,000. He wants to spend more time with them. And he also wants some time alone to pray. So he wants this. Jesus lives this solitude society. He veers from total society in the face of everybody there, in the midst of crowds, but he needs solitude. He needs time alone with his Father and time to pray and to reflect. So he needs some solitude time. All the press of the crowds, he needs some presence of his Father. But he also wants more time with the crowd. And this is a big issue. Why does he want more time with them? I have my own theory. I think he wants to explain to them, as I think I've mentioned before, what to do with all these leftovers. We have a God of plenty, abounding in abundance, turns water into what? Wine. Huge amounts of excess wine. We got a story here of after he feeds the 15, 20,000, there are 12 baskets full of these loaves of bread. Now, what do you do with all this excess? And how do you handle the abundance and more than you need? And I think Jesus wants some time to give this theology of leftovers with the crowd. We don't know. It doesn't say. But he wants more time with the crowd. He sends his disciples. They don't want to go. And so it's very clear Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. So Jesus is looking at his disciples in the middle of this lake. He's watching them. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. This is huge. So he's taking a shortcut. He's going to get there before they do. He's always getting there before we do. I mean, always. We're always catching up to him. Even when we start and going ahead, he's still. So he's going to take the shortcut. He just walk on the water to get there ahead of them so he can greet them when they arrive. And he sees them struggling. He sees them struggling and straining in the midst of this wind. And it says, he was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, oops, they see me, okay? They thought he was a ghost. Now, the word here, it varies, but it means a phantasm, a creature, sea creature, a ghost. I translated best sea monster. They thought it was a sea monster. They cried out because they saw him and they were terrified. In other words, it's another story of the disciples not recognizing Jesus. Now this is dark. I personally believe that Jesus had this divine aura that was, it's not like a halo, but just this glow that radiated from him a bit. So you can see this, if there was this numinous kind of aura around him, no wonder they were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It's me. It is I. Do not be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus and ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, the villages, towns, countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. All right, so let's get the story right. Jesus taking a shortcut. He's going to get there to the other side before they do. He sees them struggling, and his first reaction is to pass them by, to go by them. In other words, they can deal with it. They can deal with it. And then they see him. When they see this thing, they don't recognize him. They're terrified. So Jesus' compassion takes over. And here it says he climbs into the boat, and when he gets into the boat, then he calms the storm. This is another calming of the storm story. We have a couple of storm stories. One where he's sleeping in a pillow in a boat and calms the storm. Another one here, they're struggling in the midst of this squall, the winds. But did you notice anything? Did you notice anything? Okay, let me read John. Just did you notice anything? See, sometimes what isn't there is important as what is. So let me read Let me read John. Here's John. John 6. When evening came, his disciples went down by the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. Okay, again, they didn't recognize Jesus. They see this creature in the midst of the lake, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Now notice how this is phrased here. Then they were willing to take him into the boat. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but they had gone away alone. Then some boats came from Tiberias, landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. All right, now same story, little variation, but I hope you're noticing something, okay? Jesus is walking on water, gonna take a shortcut, pass them in the slow lane, but they're not just in the slow lane, they're in the stuck lane. These disciples are stuck in the storm. And then they see this thing, and then they scream in terror, and Jesus takes compassion in his eye. Now notice what this is. Don't be afraid. Then they were willing to take him into the boat. In other words, at first they were not willing. Okay. No, do you notice anything? Notice anything? Here, both in Mark and in John, what's missing? Peter! There's no Peter! There's no Peter story. In fact, if Mark, as some scholars believe, is really masquerading a bit of Peter's own account, Peter's leaving himself out of the story because he doesn't want himself in this story. The very thing we know the story for, which is Peter, is what Peter, well, neither Mark nor John thought the Peter story was significant enough a part of the story to tell it. In other words, this story is about something other than Peter. And Peter's getting out of the boat, walking on the water, and no, this story is about something else. For Mark and for John, it carries a deeper meaning than getting out of the boat. In fact, well, let's actually read today's account. Are you ready? Here we go. Then Jesus commanded his disciples to get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. Once again, the disciples are saying, "No, we'll wait for you." Jesus goes, "No." One place says he made them. Here it says he commanded them. But clearly, they want to hang with him, and he's going, "No, I'll meet you there in the morning. Don't worry about me. I want more time with the crowds. I want more time alone." And he sent the crowds away. While he sent the crowds away, he went up into the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was turbulent. During the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a spirit." In other words, the real word is phantasm. Now, the Hebrews believed that Sheol was in the depths of the earth, but Sheol had openings and fissures that kind of opened to the surface. And some of the deepest openings and fissures were under the sea. That's why the sea was a place of chaos and turbulence and fear. And so they believed that there were these sea monsters from hell, from Hades, from Sheol, that would come up periodically and spook and do all sorts of damage to ships and other things. So that's what they're thinking. They're thinking that Jesus, who's walking on the water, is really one of these sea monsters from hell, these sea creatures from Sheol. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." Okay. Now here comes Peter. But Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you," okay, let's get this right. "Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And when Peter got out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, he was afraid again. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, truly, you are the Son of God." Now, did you get that? Okay, it's incredible. Okay, when you read the story as a story and you follow the story as it, not bringing our own baggage and our own stuff to it, but just see, you derive your theology from the story. You don't deliver it from the story. You derive it. The story tells you what your theology ought to be. And so let's get the story right. The first thing we got to get is to get the story right and then trust the story. So the right story is this. Disciples are stuck in a storm. They're stuck. This is a story not about leaping out of boats and trusting Jesus in faith. This is a story about stuckness. What do you do when you get stuck? What do you do when your church gets stuck? What do you do when you get stuck? And we often get stuck in a storm. How do you handle stuckness in a storm? And clearly, in all these accounts, Jesus is expecting, he showed them how to handle stuckness. They got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. That's called stuck when you got 15, 20,000 people hungry. And Jesus shows them the power of faith to move mountains and to feed multitudes. And it says they still didn't understand. So he's expecting them to take what he had taught them and to get unstuck. I mean, he's not going to be with them forever. They got to learn to be. That's what he's got a Jesus seminary going. He's trying to teach his disciples. This is how you handle it. This is how you handle stuckness. But so he's going to pass them by and let them see. But they're totally terrified. They're totally frightened. So Jesus takes compassion on them. And then Peter, though, okay, Peter's the one who says, "Oh, I have faith." No, he says, "If it is you." Okay? This is not a, you're familiar with the Doubting Thomas story. "If it is you, Lord, put my hand in your side." Here is Peter. "If it is you." This is a Doubting Peter story. That's why he's not in Mark. Okay. This does not make Peter look good. We made Peter this, we got to have the faith of Peter. No. Peter is stiff-arming Jesus because he doesn't believe it. He still thinks it's a sea creature, even after Jesus says, "It is I." And Peter going, "Well, I don't know, but if it is you, then prove it. You show me that I can do what you can do." And so just as Thomas had to have the courage and faith to stick his hand in the wounds of Jesus, Peter, he has to doubt his doubt. Peter's, to the credit of Peter, he's doubting his doubt enough. But he's also the head of the disciples, so he's protecting, you understand this? He's keeping Jesus out of the boat because he doesn't want the sea creature in the boat. It's not, we're going to join Jesus on the water and walk on the water. No, Jesus is wanting to come into the boat, and Peter is going, "Hey, if it is you got to prove it to me, but not in here, out there." And so Peter then, Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, now, you've heard all these sermons when he takes his eyes off of Jesus. No, that's not what the story says. So he's trusting Jesus' voice, and he's trusting Jesus' voice enough to walk on that water. But then the wind comes up again, and it looks like he's not hearing the voice, and he's again, there's this sea creature, and so he begins to sink. And then it says, he was afraid and beginning to sink. And then he cried out, Lord, save me. He had enough faith to say, okay, first of all, if it is you, let me walk on the water. But now, okay, Lord, I want to trust that it's you. I believe it's you because I have walked. But, oh, you have little faith, save me. I have little faith, save me. And then Jesus reached out his hand, caught him, and said to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Hey, this isn't Doubting Peter's story. We have a Doubting Thomas story. This is a story not about getting out of the boat. It's a story of trusting Jesus to let him in the boat. See, for Noah, faith was trusting God enough to get in the boat. For here, this story is trusting Jesus enough to let what appeared to be the sea creature who sang, it is I, get in the boat. Church, ship of Zion, Jesus is knocking, let me into my church. You've been about so many other things. You've been about all these other things, and many of them are good things, but will you be about me? Will you let me be in the boat? It's my boat. Let me in. And that's how you get unstuck. That's how you get unstuck in life. Now, there are signs of stuckness. You know, when you lose your joy, you lose your confidence, you lose your faith. All these are signs of stuckness. And right now, we got a church really stuck, really stuck. So let's get the story right. Let's trust the story. The story is not about, will you step out of the boat enough so then you can walk on the water? No. It's about when you're stuck in life, how do you get unstuck? And the key to getting unstuck is to focusing on Christ, letting him become supreme and sovereign. Letting him into the boat of your life, the boat of your church, the boat of your community, the boat of your home. He stands at the door and knocks. He wants to come in. But we've got to let him in. And then the storm is stilled. Now, the disciples could have stilled the storm themselves. They could have trusted Jesus enough that storm, he says he's going to be on the other side. He sent him out there ahead of them. And they could have had the faith. That's what he said to the disciples when they woke him up when he was sleeping on a pillow. And he stilled the storm. But he says, I'm not going to still every storm in your life, but I'll still you in every storm. That's what the real faith is. Can you be in the midst of a storm and even have me sleeping? Can you be in the midst of a storm and trust me enough that I will get you to the other side, even when the midst says you're going to sink? And this is a God who will unstick us in the midst of our stuckness. And so it's a story, not about walking on water. It's a story about getting unstuck in the midst of a storm. Semiotics is the art of angling, of turning things askew, upside down, inside out, cattywampus, sunny side up, over easy, scrambled, hard-boiled. We hope you enjoyed today's journey, but always remember, it's more important you prepare the preacher than you prepare the sermon.